I would call that an attack on the free press. I would call that an attack on the First Amendment, and I think you would too. But the only difference here is that the partisan loyalties are switched here. And if we have double standards, well, we don't have any standards at all.
I went on America's #1 cable news network for a fiery debate about free speech and the First Amendment. We're going to break this down and so much more on today's episode of the Bread versus Everyone podcast, my daily show where we take on the craziest ideas from across the internet, our media, and our politics, all from an independent perspective. Guys, today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to break down a big media appearance that I just made, where on Friday I went on Fox News with host Will Cain, who I like a lot because he's one of there's only a couple shows in cable news that still do this, that still actually have guests on specifically to debate and to exchange ideas. He has Democratic elected officials on all the time and goes back and forth with them. And I just think it makes for so much more interesting TV and much more intellectually stimulating conversations than just the yes and category of cable news, which most of all three major cable news networks have primarily descended into, where they just have a host say something and then bring in a guest to agree with them and add on. I find that dull and I find that kind of insipid. But Will doesn't do that, or at least he doesn't just do that. He does a lot of fiery debates, and we got into it over on Fox News about the debate over Jimmy Kimmel's show being canceled and whether it was okay for the Trump FCC to get involved. So the context you need to know for this issue is that Jimmy Kimmel's show was preempted by Nexstar and by Sinclair and ultimately essentially canceled by ABC executives because of this controversy that stemmed over something he said, suggesting that Charlie Kirk's killer was actually MAGA and MAGA was just in denial, which is not true. It's not accurate and it's kind of gross. Anyway, though, then there was this huge pressure campaign to get rid of him, and including the FCC chair, Brendan Carr, saying on a podcast interview publicly that ABC needed to, quote, take action on Kimmel, or we could do this the easy way or the hard way, threatening the station member licenses for the various stations that carry ABC and require FCC licenses. So it was a big controversy, and I spoke out against it, saying that this kind of government involvement violates the First Amendment and is basically, a problem if you believe in free speech. Will Cain disagreed, and we had a really interesting exchange. Here's the first clip from our conversation.
If they had just decided to get rid of Kimmel, so be it. As a market decision, I don't think he's been funny in at least a decade, and I think what he said about Charlie Kirk was gross. But I think it's really, really reprehensible, and I do think it's an attack on the First Amendment for the FCC chairman to speak almost like a mafia boss and say, nice license your member stations have there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it, right? He said his exact words were, we can do this the easy way or the hard way.
Correct.
If you don't take action on Kimmel.
However,
that's jawboning.
Guys, when I say jawboning there, I'm referring to a legal term that was litigated under the Biden administration, most recently, I believe, where essentially it has been found that government officials cannot coerce private institutions or companies into censoring people in ways they couldn't do themselves. And when they privately pressure private actors, that's called jawboning. So that's what I'm referring to there, because I do think that's what happened here. The FCC has tremendous power over these broadcast networks because they are required to be licensed, whereas like traditional cable news, CNN, MSNBC, or Fox News, they're not required to be licensed. But ABC is, because it operates on a traditional broadcast line. So they have this huge pressure. They dropped this big threat, and the same day they canceled Kimmel, or effectively canceled him. The kind of specifics of it get complicated. I think that is a government coercion campaign, or at the very least, it's the appearance of one. Maybe they would have decided it anyway, but I'm a little skeptical of that. But Will argued that it really had nothing to do with that, and it was purely a private market decision. Take a listen.
Okay, I want to take this on the actions that happen and the actions that could happen. First of all, It doesn't appear that the FCC had any influence or effect on the decision by Nexstar and Sinclair and ultimately by ABC. These stations made their decision independently and by most accounts before FCC Chair Brendan Carr went on to Benny Johnson's show and uttered the words that you just repeated. This was a market-based decision. This was consumers in middle America who take Nexstar and Sinclair stations saying enough. This is the owners of those stations saying enough. And then it's ultimately the heads of ABC and Disney going, wow, we can't lose 60 stations. We've got to do something about Jimmy Kimmel. So your fear of job owning by the government simply didn't play out in the case of Jimmy Kimmel.
Well, I don't think either of us know that for certain. We can't get in the minds of the executives.
I'm repeating the reporting from both The Hollywood Reporter and The Wall Street Journal.
Right, and the show's been on air for 22 years, and it was canceled the same day he made those threats. Maybe it's a coincidence. Maybe it had no effect at all. Doesn't change the fact it is wildly inappropriate for an FCC chair to speak like this.
Let's get to that. Okay. To be clear, though, on the events of Jimmy Kimmel, my opinion right now is based in the reporting of what actually happened. Yours is based upon speculation and fear of what could have happened.
Well, there's mixed reporting.
So this was so interesting to me because Will was trying really hard to argue that, like, hey, the Trump administration had nothing to do with this. They just canceled Kimmel as a pure business decision. Like I said on the interview, if that was the case, I wouldn't care. I didn't care when they canceled Stephen Colbert, even though some liberals and progressives and media types were crying censorship, because that, from all the available reporting, was genuinely just because it was losing tons of money when they canceled The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. And so I would have no issue with that. I wouldn't care. And like I said, I don't think Jimmy Kimmel is really a great talent at this point. What bothered me was the Trump administration officials getting involved and pressuring companies to explicitly fire a media host. I find that to be an attack on the free press and the First Amendment. Now, he was saying that it is just a pure coincidence, and the reporting suggests that they just don't have anything to do with this, just coincidence that happened on the same day. Think about that for a second. It's just a coincidence that the FCC chair makes these threats, and then the same day they cancel a show that's been on air for 22 years. Like, this seems to me the bar should be on you to prove that, because that's a pretty implausible claim. But what was interesting here is he was citing the Wall Street Journal, the Hollywood Reporter, other outlets in their reporting on this, and obviously, it didn't only have to do with the FCC chair. There was an organic backlash to Kimmel's statements that the local stations were feeling pressure, and it's possible this could have happened either way. But I think if your argument is that the FCC chair threatening to revoke licenses from broadcast networks had no impact on their decision, it's just not realistic when you think of how important these licenses are. And the other thing is, he's like, oh, well, all the reporting says this. I went and looked, and I just don't really think that's true. Even the sources he mentioned did report on a connection between the FCC chair's comments and the cancellation of Jimmy Kimmel. So, for example, the Wall Street Journal and Glenn Greenwald pointed this out on Twitter. If you want to defend the events leading to Kimmel's suspension, you can obviously do so, but be honest about what happened. The triggering event, the central fact, is FCC chair Brendan Carr explicitly threatened stations with state reprisals if they continue to air Kimmel. He then links to the Wall Street Journal reporting, the same article that Will referenced on air. Here's a quote from that. Soon after, FCC Chairman Brendan Carr blasted late-night host Jimmy Kimmel on Wednesday over remarks related to the killing of conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Executives at ABC and parent company Disney knew they had a big problem. Kimmel, during Monday Night's show, had criticized how President Trump and some other Republicans were responding to the fatal shooting. Carr suggested during a podcast appearance 2 days later that the FCC could take action against the broadcast licenses of ABC-owned stations. So this is interesting because this is actually the article that Will Cain was referring to when he said the reporting suggested it had nothing to do with it. But even that article does report that the triggering event for all of this was FCC Chair Brendan Carr's comments, not Jimmy Kimmel's original comments. I think that contradicts the idea that the reporting on this is all one way and all just says it was irrelevant. Now, the other reporting here from CNN, Carr publicly stating that Disney was at risk to lose its local broadcast licenses was, quote, a real serious threat for all of ABC, a source familiar with the situation told CNN. quote, "This isn't just about Jimmy Kimmel Live. It's about all of ABC and all the shows and all employees." Another source privy to ongoing conversations at the company said. So there we have more reporting suggesting that they were very worried about this threat to their licenses. And honestly, again, guys, how could they not be? They run a massive media company that relies on these licenses, and the head of the FCC is threatening them. The idea that that's just an irrelevant factor they totally didn't consider, it just seems far-fetched to me. Though even then, guys, I wasn't saying it was the only factor, and my point was that we don't really know what's in the hearts and minds of the ABC executives when they're making this decision. And to me, it actually doesn't matter that much. Felt like Will really wanted to flesh out this point, but to me, I don't even care. It's just, I think what the Trump administration did was wrong, whether it had a big impact or not. I think they should stay out of it and let private markets decide, let consumers decide, not get involved and pressure the media networks one way or the other. So my issue was with the Trump administration's actions, regardless of how impactful they actually were. But he was really pushing back on the idea that this played any role at all. But even more reporting here from Rolling Stone. Jimmy Kimmel Live pulled indefinitely by ABC over Charlie Kirk comments. Quote, "Kimmel was taken off air by ABC and Nexstar after a threat from Trump's FCC chair. Quote, they were pissing themselves all day," one ABC insider says. So there's plenty of reporting to back up the idea that the FCC chair's comments at least played some role. And I couldn't necessarily refute that all in the moment. But again, I don't even think it's the fundamental issue at stake here. Anyway, we're going to take a look at the next part of the interview where things get a little spicy. And I offered up a counterexample that I think threw Will for a little bit of a loop. But first, guys, please do make sure you're subscribed, if you aren't yet, to the Brad versus Everyone podcast. Do hit the like button if you're watching us on YouTube. And remember, you can send in voice notes for our Voicemail Friday episodes where we react to your woke horror stories, your personal life scenarios, and answer any questions you guys have for me. All that, the link is in the description to send in one of those. So now, guys, let's take a look at this next clip from the Fox interview where I think I stumped him a little bit. I got to tell you, I think I did. Let's watch.
Well, does not appear that it had anything to do with the FCC. However, I do think it's important to move the debate forward, Brad, because just here yesterday, the commissioner said there will be other shoes that will drop. So he is saying the power of the FCC to regulate airwaves in the interest of the public resides with the FCC. Now, I, just like you, am devoted to the First Amendment. I believe not just governmentally, but culturally in the concept of free speech. However, ABC, NBC, and CBS are not Fox News. They are not CNN. They are not YouTube. They are regulated by the government. They have a monopoly on public airwaves granted to 3 or 4 licensees. And with that granted monopoly comes the regulation by the government. The regulation states is what you're doing in the interest of the public. And I think you might even agree with me that what has been programmed at all of those broadcast networks doesn't satisfy many people's definition of serving the public interest. It's one-sided, it's agenda-driven, it's often wrong, it's propaganda. How is that public interest?
Well, I think a lot of your critiques are legitimate, but I don't want the government coming in and saying for ideological or even fact-based disputes, right? In the same way, let me paint you a picture for a moment. Imagine that after the 2020 election, Biden's FCC had said to the 500 radio stations, which are also regulated by the FCC, that carry Fox News Radio, that listen, you guys got to get rid of this Sean Hannity guy, or take action on Hannity, or easy way or hard way, or those licenses could be in danger. I would call that an attack on the free press. I would call that an attack on the First Amendment, and I think you would too. But the only difference here is that the partisan loyalties are switched here. And if we have double standards, well, we don't have any standards at all.
So I like, again, I got to be honest. I like Will. I respect Will. None of this is any shade to Will. I really appreciate the dialogue and discourse, but I think I stumped him a little bit here because there is just no argument about how it would be okay for the Trump administration to pressure the broadcast networks on the TV side to get rid of a host, but you couldn't do that same thing on the radio side, which also require FCC licenses. those various networks and stations, including the very ones that carry Fox News Radio, over 500 stations. I looked it up before we went on air, and I think you either have to be against both examples or for both examples. So you could argue that, hey, like, I'm okay with the government having this power, and that means they could do it to radio, they could do it to TV. Or you could argue I'm against it in both situations, which is what I would say. That would be my position. But you can't really have one way or the other, because there's not really an explanation for why one government pressure campaign leveraging licenses to, get rid of a certain host would be okay and wouldn't violate the First Amendment, but then the other one would. There's no real explanation for that as to why that would be a double standard. That would be an inconsistency. And I think it's always helpful to test whether we're being principled and honest about an issue, to swap the parties and see if you would say the same thing. Because tribalism and partisanship, I mean, it's a hell of a drug. It can really cloud our feelings and our thinking about contentious issues. But if you just swap the labels, you always should be comfortable with the same position if you truly believe in that position. And I do when it comes to the First Amendment and these principles here. Now, I think that he could tell that was an interesting example, and I think he definitely wasn't prepared for me to make that point, and he tried to move it along in an interesting way. Let's listen to this next clip.
I looked up what does it mean to be in the public interest, Brad. It does mean a diversity of viewpoints. Do you think you can look at ABC or NBC or CBS over a half a century and say they've honored that requirement of serving the public interest, a diversity of viewpoints?
No, not necessarily, although, to be honest, I'm not sure you could look at Fox News Radio and say the same thing. I would rather let the marketplace decide.
But here's where your analogy fails.
Or not
Fox News Radio is one of many, many, dozens and dozens of stations across the country that carry various viewpoints. In the case of television, it's 3 or 4. That's it. So in radio,
they could threaten
you have
the licenses
dozens,
in the same way. You either want to play this game or you don't.
Of licensed channels to provide a multitude of viewpoints, if you will, a diversity of viewpoints to serve the public interest. That's not the way it's been in television.
None of that changes the First Amendment and free speech concerns. The Supreme Court just ruled 9-0. You cannot exert pressure on private companies as the government to make ideological-based changes or punish their viewpoints. I think it's very clear, even if I find the viewpoints reprehensible that Jimmy Kimmel espoused, that is what's happening here. And frankly, I came on Fox many times to blast the Biden administration's jawboning. They were pressuring private companies to take down free speech. When Brendan Carr gets up there and threatens to take away or revisit licenses and says we can do this the easy way or the hard way, it's wildly inappropriate. It's attack on free speech and it's attack on the First Amendment. And I would feel the same way regardless of the partisan loyalties involved.
I appreciate
the
argument. I appreciate hearing your point of view. I don't think I'm hypocritical or partisan on the application of the First Amendment. I think we are not making appropriate, or at least you in this debate, are not making appropriate accommodations for what is a congressionally regulated area of the FCC.
So this was interesting to me because he also caught me a little bit off guard in this debate with his point about, well, there's lots of radio stations, but there's only a few of these licensed traditional TV networks. And that is true. But again, I don't want to say it's irrelevant, but it's irrelevant legally speaking. It's irrelevant to the constitutional question of whether the viewpoint discrimination or ideological pressure is constitutionally permissible. How many stations there are is not really relevant to that in a court of law, in a constitutional debate. I would agree that it makes it more defensible from a news diversity or like interest in the public perspective. Yes. But I wouldn't agree that it changes the constitutional analysis at all. For example, like if you're talking about whether a policy discriminates against a church and violates freedom of religion, it's irrelevant like if it's the only church in town or if there's 100 churches in town or if it's a small denomination or a huge denomination. It's just not it's relevant in many other ways, but it's not relevant to the legal or constitutional question, at least. At least that's how I felt about it. And I did have to bring up the point that during the Biden administration, Fox News was wall to wall, oftentimes, with coverage about the Twitter files and about the White House pressuring social media companies to take down posts and ban speakers who were spreading COVID misinformation. And I was really outspoken about that at the time. being against that, thinking that was an improper role for the government to be playing and raise serious free speech concerns. And I feel the same way about the FCC in this case. And I just find it interesting how quickly things can change just because the partisanship in the White House switches or the control of Congress switches. All of a sudden, many people are singing different tunes. When I'm just, maybe I'm crazy, maybe I'm old-fashioned, I just sing the same tune regardless of who is in power at any given moment. Now, one other point that I didn't get to bring up on air, but that I would have loved to discuss, is that one way to address Will's valid concerns about there being only a couple of stations that get television licenses from the FCC would be to abolish the FCC, which is an interesting idea I find myself very drawn to. I think it's an outdated and anachronistic institution and federal body. And the libertarian columnist and editor Nick Gillespie published a piece in the Free Press about this. He wrote, "Abolish the FCC. Trump isn't the first one to use the agency to punish critics. Every president has done so. There's a clear way to end that abuse." He writes, "Whatever technical functions it might have once served, it was founded in 1934 to regulate the radio, among many other forms of communications, the FCC now serves almost exclusively as a way for politicians to police speech and block business deals they don't like, all under the maddeningly vague cover of serving the, quote, public interest. Today, the FCC has a budget of about $390 million and a staff of about 2,000. What would an America without the FCC look like? Something like the one we're in, but with more, better, and faster innovations and less government jawboning about political speech. As Trump's White House AI and crypto czar, David Sachs, suggested last October, the federal government could auction off broadcast spectrum, which TV and radio networks use for free in exchange for requirements to, quote, serve the public interest. The proceeds from the auction would go to reducing the national debt, and the status quo would continue if broadcast networks are still the most highly valuable use. The far more likely outcome, Sachs said, would be that valuable spectrum will be reapportioned to the next generation of wireless applications, unleashing many more interesting options for consumers and businesses. So this idea interests me a lot because I do agree with Nick's fundamental premise that maybe it was once necessary because you couldn't have television networks broadcasting on the same frequency, or you had to coordinate the radio frequencies and all this kind of outdated technocratic stuff. I don't think we need it anymore in the modern era. With all the technology that we have, we could just auction these off and close down this institution, because as long as you have a government body licensing and regulating media, whoever is in charge of that body, Democrats or Republicans, it's going to be political. It's going to be ideological. It's going to be used as some form of pressure tool or censorship item. Now, maybe in Trump's case, they are just more blunt about it. They're just more open about it because that's their style. And given that it doesn't really appear to serve much of a purpose anymore, why not just get rid of this? End the recipe for future abuse on either side by privatizing all of it and letting the market sort it out. That would solve really this whole dispute, and then we wouldn't have to litigate these kinds of censorship, First Amendment versus asserting the public interest kind of issues in the future. I thought that was really interesting from Nick, and a perspective I hadn't considered before. But what do you guys think? And did you agree with me, or were you more on the side of the host over on Fox, Will Cain? Let me know in the comments. Make sure to subscribe if you aren't yet. Hit that like button, yada, yada, yada. Remember to send in your voicemails for my Voicemail Friday episodes. And with that, guys, we'll talk again real soon.